So let me just, okay. And so Arthur, just because sometimes I'll just pull the audio without the video, if I could get you to say your full name and then the pronouns that you want me to refer to you by when I'm speaking about you.
Arthur Garrison, he.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I want to just jump in and talk about Chained to the System. What was the impetus behind writing that book?
That book started as a paper at a conference. And so I wanted to look at the issue of disproportionate minority confinement and policing. And so I wrote the paper and I wanted to look at it from the politics and the rhetoric of criminal justice policymaking, by our national politicians. Anyway, so the paper is going fine, and then the paper is growing. And by the time I was at the conference, the paper was actually much longer than a conference paper should be. And I presented it. And the people there said, "Oh, this is wonderful. You need to make an article out of this." And so I did. So, you clean and you write and you add. And before I knew it, it was too long for a law review article. And so I started to massage it and clean it. And next thing I know, the book is there. And so it was a process over, I think, a year and a half, 2 years from when I first started until it came out as a book, maybe about 2 years, give or take. And so what I wanted to do was look at criminal justice policymaking from the rhetorical, narrative, elective point of view and how we got the way we got. So the book presents itself as explaining that the criminal justice system in America is not just something that just showed up. It didn't just beam down from the sky. It actually is a result of political decisions, political rhetoric, concepts of right and wrong, and perspectives about who you think criminals are. And as a result, that's how the book came about.
Wow. Well, I want to know, like, what is your background? What is your educational background? Like, what got you into this work? What got you interested in the criminal justice system and in politics in the first place?
Well, I was a political science major at Kutztown University. And after I graduated, I eventually got my master's degree. And then while I was getting my master's degree, I took a job as a pre-sentence investigation officer in Newcastle County, Delaware. And soon after that, I took a job as a criminal justice planning officer at the Delaware Criminal Justice Council, which is a state agency that handles all federal funds coming into the state with criminal justice, and they're subgranted to various law enforcement, public defender, prosecutor, nonprofit organizations to do whatever they're doing. And I was there for about 11 years. And then I took another job in Georgia for a year and left, and then came back up and got my doctoral degree in law and policy from Northeastern University and transitioned into teaching. So I've done the government administrator thing, watched how politics and policy is made. And then after my term in government was over, I decided I wanted to teach, and then ended up at Kutztown. And I'm in my 12th year now at Kutztown teaching criminal justice. So I teach criminal justice policy making, criminal law, criminal procedure, legal history, and criminal justice history. And my area of expertise is law and policy.
Mm. Something that you said that stood out to me about your work history was you said, I forget the exact name of the job escaped me, but you were talking about how you were dealing with like the funding, the money part of it, like how things get funded, you said, or how things are paid for. And I was just like, my brain hooked onto that. And I thought, oh yeah. Because dollars and policy really determines outcomes. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of the kind of financial implications of criminal justice, or like how money shapes
Well,
policy.
in a capitalistic society, which America is, um, the criminal justice system is a government agency. So outside of asset forfeiture, which is a whole other story by itself, outside of asset forfeiture, criminal justice doesn't produce something people pay for. Criminal justice serves a governmental purpose, so you pay for it. But the criminal justice system doesn't create widgets, right? Right. So you and I go and invent the proverbial widget, okay, and we sell it. That's how we get money. That's how we get enough money to invent widget 2.0 and whatever else, right? Okay. Criminal justice doesn't function that way. Criminal justice is a governmental purpose. It is going back to theories of law. So it doesn't generate money in of itself. It gets paid through taxes. All right, then. So it's a political thing. All right. So federal government, going back to the 1960s, started funding states to do criminal justice programs, right? It was part of the Great Society thing. Okay. So in Delaware, what I would do is the Justice Department has a certain budget in which it sends funds to all the states after the states send grants up to the Justice Department saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And there's all sorts of federal grants all over the place. I supervised the Juvenile Justice Grant and the Byrne Grant, which are the two biggest grants. And so depending on the state allocation, you get $1 million, $2 million. Some states get $20, $30 million, whatever the story is. So we decide, and there's a whole process in how we decided things. We decided what we were going to do with the federal funds the Justice Department was giving us based within the larger parameters of what the Justice Department said they would fund. So we would fund police departments and police initiatives, attorney generals, because in Delaware, the attorney general is the state prosecutor as opposed to Philadelphia, which is the district attorney. And we would fund prosecutors, special divisions, special initiatives, same with the public defenders. And we would also fund nonprofit, street level community organizations and crime prevention and all sorts of things. So depending over the 15 years, there's all sorts of programs that I helped develop and fund, because one of my jobs in the Criminal Justice Council was to work with all these organizations in writing the grants, putting them together, and then sending them up. And we think of what it is that we're going to do. And then when we would get the money, we would sub-grant it to all these different organizations, and I would work with them in preparing the grants to get awarded by the Criminal Justice Council. So we were basically a funding pass-through agency as well as a funding planning agency. The planning is where you see politics and where you see how people make choices about what they want to fund and what they don't want to fund. And then you see how politicians do things. So I had a full experience in seeing the politics of criminal justice as well as the policy of the criminal justice. I also supervised evaluations of programs we funded because we want to know if they work. And that's a whole other part of the story. So that's what I was doing for 12 years. And then that is the expertise that I bring when I'm teaching and the perspective I bring in my writing, including my book, Change the System.
Can you, Arthur, give an example of either a systemic change or a policy that is effective, and then an example of one that you've seen that really is not effective? And again, I'm sure you have many, many, many examples, but I'm curious, like if someone's listening and they're not very familiar with the criminal justice system in any capacity, like what's an example of a time when things have gone well, or a set of systems that you're like, well, this is actually an effective model. And then what's an example of where it's very clear to you, or at least in your professional background, that like, actually, this is something that we do that doesn't work, that's not effective?
Okay. First thing I'll say is this: whether something is effective depends on what you've designed it to do, where you designed it to work, and if you thought all that through. So let me give you a classical example that criminal justice has learned generally. Now, this is not politics, this is policy. Okay. I'll get to the politics of what I'm saying in a moment. Here's policy. Let's say, for instance, you have an area where crime is increasing. Okay. If you, and I'm the police commissioner, if you give me enough money, manpower, I can reduce crime in that area by myself. All the other issues that we talk about why crime occurs, if you give me the proper resources, I can stop crime in that area. We know that because police saturation, short term, will stop any crime in any neighborhood. We've known this since the 60s. Bratton proved it with broken windows theory. And we did it in Delaware when we had an increase in shooting problems. Law enforcement in of itself can stop crime. All right. Now, here is the other half of that story. That can only be done for a limited period of time. Within the limited period of time, any police commissioner can stop crime in any area. The problem is you can't keep that up indefinitely. And now that's the rub. So if you have crime in your area, yeah, a police commissioner can stop crime in a particular area, a particular geographic area. Absolutely. What he does is just saturates it with uniformed police and other crime suppression police programs, and crime will stop because the criminals will either disperse or will stop behavior. The problem is the police commissioner cannot do that forever. At a certain point, he runs out of resources. At a certain point, other areas want his attention. At other areas, she runs out of the political support because there's always backlash when you do police suppression. So at a certain point, she can't do it anymore. So she withdraws. When policing withdraws from police saturation, crime will go back up because simple deterrent theory actually does work. You don't do crime in the street if a police officer is standing there on the same street, because you will get caught and you'll go to jail, and you don't want to go to jail. So you don't do the crime in that area. Crime drops like a stone. The problem is you can't keep that up forever. Okay. Policy-wise, that's how it works. Politics now tells you the following. Politics doesn't want to talk about that back end because it doesn't suit certain people's narrative. Other people don't want to talk about the front end of that because it doesn't suit their narrative. And so when the reality of life kicks in and the police commissioner can't do that saturation past 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, or the program that we used to implement it goes from being a strategy to a program. And the distinction is the level of intensity and the level of focus that's going on. When it just becomes a program, we had one program, and make a long story short, when we were initially doing it, it came from the governor, the mayor, and the police chief. Mm. And it worked. When it became an institutionalized program, it fell down to a lieutenant. And all the other politicians went on to go do other things. The intensity, the focus, the energy, funding disappeared. The community support disappeared. And then it just kind of slowly bled into everything else the police department is doing, and it slowly disappeared in intensity, and then crime rebalances and comes back up. So criminal justice policy can work. It depends on how you define it. One final example. I did a program dealing with drug addiction. And the point that we learned in the evaluation is that not every drug prevention program works with every type of addict. And there are different types of addicts at different points in why they're addicted. There's a difference between a nurse who gets caught in addiction to a drug and you have to rehabilitate her versus somebody who was never habilitated in the first place who's addicted to drugs. The nurse all you have to do is bring them back to where they were before they started using drugs and deal with where they went south. Somebody who's been on drugs since forever, there's not a habilitation and their life before drugs to tap into. So for those kind of addicts, you need a different program design than the doctor, the nurse, the lawyer. Something happened, they go south and they're on drugs. There's a different way they're approached, and there's a different reason why they're addicted. So here's the point. One size does not fit all. And if you don't design your program properly, you think design A will work on addict B, and then you will fail. And then people will say, see, rehabilitation doesn't work, build more prisons. Mm-hmm. And that was a conversation that happened in the 70s, in which, make a long story short, the nothing works mentality prevailed. And that's where the crime control model and Reagan comes in.
Yeah. Well, in everything that you just said, I'm thinking about the need for sort of nuance and individuation and approaches that are sort of, I guess I want to say like sensitive and aware. But then I think about how our systems are set up and they really aren't set up that way. And so how to I guess I'm curious about that tension and like what is supportive when those tensions come to light that, yeah, actually one size fits all isn't viable, but sometimes I think maybe there's not the time or the resources or the emotional availability for people to really slow down long enough to think about, okay, well, what is needed in this case or in this community or in this situation?
Well, criminal justice since the 80s, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, planners have been trying to do that. Nobody argues that the system works for everybody the same way. Nobody's under that delusion. All the hard work, all the politics, all the different theories, the argument over progressive prosecutors versus more traditional prosecutors, all of that is going into what you're saying. We are all trying to figure out how we can reach the individual victim and the individual perpetrator and figure out what services we can provide individually while having a macro view in operation. It's a giant macro machine that we're trying to make to work on a micro level per person. And it is a constant in trying to figure out how to do that balance. We are just constantly working on it. There is no, there's the answer. You have therapy courts, you have specialty courts and special prosecutors and prosecutors specializing in different things. We've been trying to do this since the advent in the 1800s of making courts, juvenile courts and adult courts. And at one time, there was a theoretical, philosophical difference between male prisons and female prisons. Make long story short, we've pretty much abandoned the distinction. And I'm not sure women didn't get the short end of the stick when we abandoned the distinction. But we're still trying to, how do we deal with women who have children who are in prison? And then in the 80s and 90s, we began to care about men who are fathers. And how do we deal with that when they're in prison and their children? It's a constant trying to get that individualism with a macro design machine.
What did you mean by when you said, I'm not sure women didn't get the short end of the stick with the abandonment of the distinction between male and female prisons?
Female prisons originally, now there's a racial component, but we're going to leave that aside. Let's just take the general thing. The theory about women criminals in the late 1800s, both here and in England, the theory was the reason that they are criminal is because some man took advantage of them and they were not taught the women's role in society wasn't inculcated in them when they were girls. So they don't need punishment. They need to be brought into the femininity that they have. And the reason that they are criminals is because it wasn't given to them and taught into them, or some man took advantage of them. So female prisons were built along a cottage mentality and a mentality of family orientation. And it was very rehabilitated oriented. So a woman comes in and she's a criminal. Okay, so now we teach her how to be a homemaker and home economics and how to sew. And so it was paternalistic, don't get me wrong, but it was built on the idea that we don't punish them because women are the softer sex, so on and so forth. And so we're going to care for them and get them in a place where when they leave, they can take care of themselves, get married, have a family, have kids, so on and so forth. That was the mindset. Now, male prisons is, okay, we need to punish these barbarians. There was rehabilitation had its limits in theory. Men was about punishment and incapacitation. So women had rehabilitation and it was not harsh. Men's prisons were men's prisons. All right. As the women's movement came in and paternalism crashed and burned and we're all equal, women's prisons became like men's prisons. So, and then we, in the 80s and the 90s, as we were trying to figure out what to do with women who were in prison and were mothers, and then we realized, wait a minute, fathers are in prison and they matter too. Okay, that's where we are now. And we're trying to balance the thing. But the paternal protective theory had its issues, but women's prisons were not what they are now. So, and I'm not so sure women didn't get the short end of the stick when we threw, when we threw the paternalism out. I'm not sure they got all that much better a deal with treating them like we treat men in prisons.
Yeah. Oh, I can totally see that. And you said leaving the race issue aside, and I was going to ask you about bias because I think, just bias in the criminal justice system because race is so heavily infused in how people are punished, who's punished, what the punishments are, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, it's a huge subject, but if you can talk a little bit about it and how bias comes into play in the criminal justice system.
That is one of the overarching themes in my book, Chained to the System, and the first book that I wrote, Race in Criminal Justice History, the whole issue of how race comes in. I tell my students, look, in theory, race should have nothing to do with the criminal justice system. It shouldn't matter in the slightest. Okay, we all know that it does all over the place. Why? Okay, Reader's Digest version of the whole story. Okay, colonies show up, Virginia, slavery, 1619, and the purpose, and we need to control these slaves. The need to control these slaves in the South births the slave patrols. It birthed the slave laws, which said slaves, by definition, had to be Black. Indentured servitude slowly is washed out of America. Laws specifically say whites cannot be slaves. All right then. So slavery and Black skin, by definition, by statute, is showing up in the middle to late 1600s. All right then. Slave patrols show up. The whole purpose of slave patrols was to prevent slave rebellions, chase down runaway slaves. And that issue bleeds all the way through American history up and into the Civil War, 200 plus years of this. All right, then. Civil War is over. Reconstruction is abandoned 10 years later. Jim Crow takes over, and we have a century of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is adopted by the North, and now the North and South agree on the following. Blacks are second-class citizens, and the South teaches the North, and the North goes along with it in the history of criminal justice, that Black behavior is to be criminalized because that's the only way to bring them to a state of slavery under the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment says you can't have slavery. And then there's this little phrase in the middle of it, unless convicted of a crime. And that's where it is. So true, you cannot enslave Blacks. 13th Amendment, Civil War, we clean that up. Okay. But if they're convicted, you can be. So in America, on paper, in the Constitution, you can be a slave as long as you are convicted of a crime first. So that's what they unleashed on Black people. The criminal justice system replaced slavery as a system of social control. Okay. That gives us 100 years from 1865 through 1968. In that whole period, the criminal justice system is seen as a way to control Blacks. Okay, Jim Crow writ large has got all sorts of other problems. Those two together is where race gets infused into everything. And that is systemic racism. America dealt with systematic racism in 64, 65, and 68. Okay, now some would disagree slightly with that as a historical matter, but let's just stay with the general theme. 68, America ended Jim Crow on paper, amen. Okay, but 100 years of this functioning, and then the machine just functioning afterwards, is systemic. Systemic is not somebody sitting there saying, I'm going to discriminate against you. We saw that, okay? 2020 is not 1920. I'm totally there, okay? But systemic racism, think of it this way. You're in a car and you have your foot on the gas going up the hill. Systematic. You come over the hill and you're speeding down. Your foot is still on the accelerator. Systematic. Halfway down, you take your foot off the gas and you let gravity, the direction of the car, keep going. Okay, you don't have any more systematic. You don't have your foot on the accelerator. But the car is going in the same direction, functioning the same way. That's systemic. Until you turn the car and make it go in a different direction, you have systemic. And so that is the thing. Now, of course, the problem is in our politics and our rhetoric. One, people don't know the difference between systematic and systemic. And people who are against this whole conversation know people don't know the difference and imply that systematic and systemic is the same thing. And so that goes into narrative battles and elections. And I also get into that in the book, ending with explaining where Trump came from.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for that comprehensive breakdown, because I think it's very, very important, because people will point to, well, our policies are better on paper, but then also at the same time, like there's no accounting for the 40% incarceration statistics of BIPOC individuals, who account for like 13% of the population. And so I think it explains how and why some of these things are still operational. I'm curious, given your identity, and Arthur, I don't mean to presume like what anyone's background is, but how much does your identity inform your interest in this work?
Oh, well, as a Black male and as a Christian Black male, I find, and as also a social scientist, and I believe that history is important. That guides how I view things, because there are a lot of, I say this, America's a great country in spite of her foolishness. Okay. America's a great country in spite of her sins. I'm totally there. Where I leave white social conservative worldview is I don't pretend there were no sins in the first place. And that's the, I'm what I call classical, traditional African American conservative thought, right? I'm what my parents told me. Now that's all. Getting into a whole thing about how one generation dropped the ball after the civil rights movement. That's a whole other conversation for another day. But here's how I was raised. They said, now, son, yeah, racism exists. No debate. Amen. We good. Okay. You need to know 2 and 2 is 4. To get the same job, a white man needs to know 1 and 1 is 2 to get the job. Now that's how it is. Yeah, so racism exists. We're not debating that it doesn't. But my parents said, the racism that exists has got nothing to do with whether or not you act the fool. My translation of my Jamaican parents' way of saying it, because I guarantee you, they said it in a much more cooler way. And that's how I translate, because I can't get the twang and whatever else. But the point is that America being racist has nothing to do with me not doing well in school, me not doing this, and me acting the fool in the street, right? Mom and dad weren't putting up with that. And mom and dad were going to say, well, you know, the fault is the white man. No, wasn't it? No. Was raised with a conservative point of view. No, you succeed in spite of the fact that racism runs wild. Okay. What differentiates me from white social conservatives that, you know, run the Republican Party and do all the rest of the other kind of thing is that the first premise is disavowed. And they say, well, no, there's no racism at all, so don't act the fool. So they discount 400 years of American history, right? We are now having an argument about whether 1619 is part of American history. They want to start American history at 1776, which is very convenient because you wipe out 200 years of slavery. And I heard one commentator say, no, America didn't start until 1789 when Washington was president, which means slavery is only 70-something years old. Now, there's a difference between slavery is 70 years old and more than 200 and something years old. There's a political outcome that shows up from that logic, right? And also, let's say, for instance, okay, let's talk about this thing policy-wise. Let's forget slavery for a moment. Let's start 1865, right? 1865, America was a third-rate nation. Half of it was in rubble. Nothing that we say in modern society existed yet. The horse and buggy still drove the train, right? Okay. If America had just said then, all right, look, Black people, slavery was wrong. We had a civil war to end it. Look, go forth with your 40 acres and a mule, and we'll make sure that the law applies to you equally. Go forth and leave us alone. If America had just done that, right? Give them the 200 and something years of slavery. Start 1865. If that had been done, Black presidents would be no more of a novelty than apples on apple trees. And America wholesale would be a different country. But that's not what America did. America grew. Now here's a side point attached to that. When America in 1865 to 1945, America went from a third-rate nation, half in rubble, to a world power running the world in that period. In that same period, Jim Crow was in his golden era. So America went from third-rate to top first-rate while keeping Blacks second, third-rate. And America let Blacks get out of second-rate status after the cement of America going from nothing to greatness had already been solidified. So they solidified Black inabilities on all sorts of levels solidified a white middle class, and then after all that happened, then said in 68, Jim Crow is over, go forth and make money. But America in 68 was not wet cement. America in 1968 was pretty hard cement. And there's a difference. And that, again, coming back around, is explaining systemic racism.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Arthur, I'm thinking too about how you've said, that like you don't want to throw out the entirety of this nation. You're not saying like, well, every single thing about this country is horrible and I hate it. And I was reminded of a YouTube video that I saw you in when you said actually policing is a noble profession. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that because it seems like your perspective is not what we often see, which is this binary perspective of, okay, it's either we keep things as they are and they're good, or we throw everything out and we start over and whatever. And so can you talk a little bit about what you've said about policing being a noble profession? And then also maybe talk about how you navigate that line between acknowledging the things that really are horrible and built into the system and sort of concretize, and yet don't seem to be wholesale rejecting this country or, every policy or every person.
Okay. So I tell my students that policing is a noble profession, and I want to know why. Okay, so jump back into the 1600s. John Locke is sitting there asking himself, why does government exist and what makes it a just government? All right then. So he does the social compact experiment that he got off Hobbes. And make long story short, man at his nature is no good. Okay. Left to his devices, man will rob, kill, rape, and pillage simply because he can. Okay. Man does evil because he wants to. That's it. Man's evil. Let's get with the program. Okay. So Locke says, and Hobbes said the same thing, that the reason we form government is to keep man's evil nature unleashed, to keep the men and women of the world who do evil and take advantage of the weak and whatever else, we need to keep them on a leash. Okay, then. Make long story short, that's where cops come in. That's what makes them noble. Because reason that we can walk down the street, the reason you can walk down the street without being afraid of being kidnapped and all sorts of abominations being done to you is because we have laws and we have people with sticks, badges, and guns who enforce them. That is the purpose of policing. That is noble, because you can't have anything else if you can't have peace in your neighborhood. There is nobility in being the warrior, protector, the guardian. Now, I tend to see police in the guardian model as opposed to the warrior model, but hold that aside, we'll come back around. That's what makes policing noble. They make sure the rest of us can walk, talk, eat, sleep in peace. That is noble. Now, when cops abuse their power, because we give police the power to enforce, if necessary, kill, to protect everybody else. That's what they are, no problem. When they abuse that right, they're abusing something very noble. That's why crooked cops and cops that do evil, we should drop the entire criminal justice system on their heads, because they're destroying the very foundation of why government exists. That's what makes them noble, and that's why we should be hard on them when they act the fool and do injustice. Now, okay, come now into the American context. The context of America is that you stop blacks because they're black. You stop black males because they're black males. You abuse your power because you know nobody's going to believe them over you anyway. And barring there's a film where you're choking somebody to death in the street, you're not going to jail for abusing your power. So when you do abuse the power, society has a right to raise all sorts of cane. But that doesn't change the fact that you are noble. And so I try and tell my students, you have to see the nobility, because I have a lot of my students want to be cops or prosecutors or attorneys or whatever else, or probation and parole officers. You have to really buy into the nobility of what you are. And your nobility dates back to the philosophy of Western theory of why government exists, right? Of all the governmental functions, you show up first, law enforcement and protecting society. And that's why you are noble. Understanding the nobility of it is why I appreciate the guardian model as opposed to the warrior model. Make a long story short, the warrior model is what the LAPD was built on. Okay. We are enforcers, we crack heads, and we do not prevent crime. We investigate crime and find the offenders. The guardian model is we are protectors of society who, when necessary, we can use force, but our job is to exist so crime doesn't exist. The Robert Peel version of policing. And American policing has shifted and flown between the warrior model and the guardian model. Now, depending on which model you pick and your politics about it, and then we add on to it who you unleash the police on, now that's where race and that's where the whole problem comes in for more than 400 years, starting with the slave patrols.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I've been thinking a lot about, and next season we're doing an episode on sort of emotionality at work and how we're able to kind of communicate our emotions, show up emotionally, be vulnerable. And I'm curious, like how that all intersects with the criminal justice system. Like sort of showing up and being authentic and empathetic, et cetera. And like where, in your assessment, where the criminal justice system as a whole is with emotionality and how that influences policy.
I think the younger, more educated police chiefs, progressive prosecutors, judges, I think that's why you can tell this, because there's a backlash against them. They are trying to look at everything from the guardian point of view, not the warrior point of view. And they believe the purpose of the criminal justice system is not to hunt people down, build prisons, and put people under them. Now, that's what we thought in the 80s and 90s into the first decade of the following century. And that has produced all sorts of problems. But today, I think criminal justice practitioners are like saying, okay, prison is not the beginning and answer to all things. And cops dropping SWAT teams on people to execute warrants, and that's a whole other problem. That's not the answer. So we're trying to look at it from the guardian point of view. Now, the guardian point of view, in part, has, as you would say, this an emotional content that it matters how people feel and see and perceive the criminal justice system. Because what we know as a policy matter, police officers who are not trusted, the criminal justice system who's not trusted, people will not tell them what they need to know. And that causes problems. And also when we evaluate programs, we need to know why we think they work. And the evaluation is built on the premise of the program in the first place. And a lot of times, it's the premise that's the problem. Progressive prosecutors, and they're catching blowback because of this, are realizing, you know what, there are a lot of premises in the criminal justice system that are 30 years old, and we know better. But there are a lot of old bulls who don't want to change. And you'd be surprised who the old bulls that don't want to change are, because on paper, they should know better. But that's where we come back to politics and narrative. And also we come back to some ugly issues of politics, power, and don't you tell me how to run my house. And that's also an explanation of how criminal justice system works, because a lot of the old bulls think they are totally authentic. And on some levels, we have to outlive them. Some levels, hopefully we can get rid of them. maybe we might be able to convince them, but some change is not going to happen quickly because these old bulls are there and they have walls and they ain't going anywhere. And if you interview progressive prosecutors, they'll tell you from their point of view, they'll tell you the problem isn't that complicated because you have two institutions and these two institutions have old bulls and they won't move. But the bulls think they're being authentic, and so they are.
By two institutions, are you referring to the Supreme Court and Congress, or what two institutions?
No. On the ground level, judges and police departments. They have old bulls that have been here that were raised in the 80s. That's a whole other thing what they were raised with, but raised in the 80s, crime control model, their job of the criminal justice system is incapacitation, incarceration, retribution. And rehabilitation is their problem as they're sitting in the prison cell trying to keep from getting killed. And there is no telling them anything. And if you talk to progressive prosecutors, they'll tell you their biggest problem is the judges and then the police departments because they are politically entrenched with the system functioning a certain way. And they don't want to hear anything out of you liberal prosecutors telling us that incapacitation, incarceration, and retribution is not the beginning and the end of all that there is in criminal justice. Go touchy-feely, go somebody else. And so you have some judges that are old bulls and they're not moving. You have some younger judges who are open to seeing that, yeah, incapacitation, incarceration is not the beginning and the end of the story. You have some police chiefs you can't tell anything to. You have other police chiefs that are with the program. And even with police chiefs who are with the program, that doesn't mean the captains and the lieutenants are. And as any police chief will tell you, it may be a paramilitary organization, but that doesn't mean when the chief speaks, everybody says, yes, sir. It doesn't work that way. And so police chiefs, you can get rid of a police chief much faster than you can get rid of a captain or a lieutenant. And sergeants and anybody that studies criminal policing knows that push comes to shove on street level, sergeants run the police department because sergeants run the patrol officers and sergeants give overtime and sergeants don't give overtime and sergeants approve things and sergeants don't approve things. So if you have a sergeant who's an old bull, some bright idea in the head of an officer is going nowhere. And if the lieutenant comes in and the captain comes in with some bright idea, all the officers in the squad will say, yes, sir. And then they give a side eye to the sergeant. And if the sergeant gives a side eye going back, ain't nothing gonna happen.
Oh my God. So, I'm not going to ask you to give the conclusion of your book because people just need to buy it and read it. But when you think about beginning the process of getting unchained to the system, what's something that you wish that people knew or that people could think about or try to implement?
The criminal justice system is a machine with multiple parts and multiple players and multiple politics and multiple power schemes. So honestly, I'm not under the delusion that the whole entire machine can be changed. There are too many interlocking parts. But what I try and what my approach is over time, as we put more people into it in their youth, educated and move up from sergeants to captain, to lieutenants, to captains, to deputy chiefs, to chiefs, and baby prosecutors become senior prosecutors and policymaking prosecutors and district attorneys. And then some get elected to Congress and governorships. All of that will begin to change policy because unfortunately, narrative of how you think the world works, political battle over narrative, and that's politics and elections, those have to change first before policy gets changed because policy comes after narrative and politics, not before. So it's a very long-term project. I mean, look at the progressive prosecutors who are in the major cities now. They're making their changes. Some are doing better than others. Some are hitting old bulls. Some of them are figuring out ways around them, over them, or through them. But all of them are catching blowback by people who think the criminal justice system is incapacitation, incarceration, retribution, period. And so some of them will be more successful than others. And of course, how long do they stay there? Do they stay there past a decade, which means now they can make some changes to the concrete? Do they get outvoted and we vote somebody back in who's crime control oriented, and then we go back to the default that's in criminal justice and some of these bulls, and we just start locking people up and start building prisons? So it's a very long-term project. And so you try and change the gear and the bolt that you're in charge of, and you hope in changing those gears and bolts and maybe a belt, somebody that otherwise would have been put in prison forever or put in prison when they don't need to be will do something else. One final thing, one of the problems with prison is this, especially with juveniles. If you lock up a juvenile the wrong time, they don't understand consequences. If you lock up a different juvenile at the wrong time, they get institutionalized and jaded. That's where that individual thing that you were talking about. It's not a one size fits all. Some juveniles need to be put under the prison and kept there. I'm totally with you. Some of them, they're just too far gone. I'm totally with you. Other juveniles, they're just young, stupid, acting the fool. But if you put them in prison, they'll get hurt and there'll be no fixing it. And there's a difference. And knowing the difference when you are a prosecutor, a cop, a judge, probation and parole officer is the whole game.
As someone who is kind of, you're teaching, you're imparting knowledge, you're imparting insights and wisdom into the generation who will become part of the system and hopefully be agents of change. Arthur, what are you hoping that your students take away after a semester or 2 semesters or whatever? Like, what for you is a win if they get a certain insight or nugget, or like, what do you want them to take with them from each semester?
Oh, that just what you said. If a student comes in and doesn't get a concept, and I can tell they don't get it, either they don't get it or they're not buying it. And then all of a sudden, they look at you and you can see the light bulb and they get it. Okay, I'm good. Specifically, when it comes to race and criminal justice system, I want them to see that there's a history. There's a reason why if you're a cop and you're talking to a Black male, he may be angry and not responsive to you because he doesn't see you. He sees the uniform. And when he sees the uniform, he's going back to 1619. Getting students to grasp that and why. Even if they think it, even if they don't buy it, if they grasp that why, when they become cops, maybe their approach will be different. And they'll understand why we want their approach to be different. I have turned students that want to go to law school become prosecutors. I want them to buy the minister of justice concept of prosecutors, meaning your job is not to win the case at all costs, and you don't care how you win. Your job is not to think you're good because you won, because there are many cases he's innocent, but you can still prove him guilty, right? Being innocent has nothing to do with the criminal trial. Criminal trial is about whether the prosecutor proves you're guilty. You being innocent has nothing to do with the trial, okay? But the prosecutor is the only one in the courtroom that's supposed to care if you're innocent. The prosecutor has to believe you are guilty to walk into the front door. But there's a moral concept to that. And so I try and get my students who are prosecutors to be, okay, do you have to prosecute this case? Do you have is there another option? Right? The Minister of Justice model for prosecutors thinks about the case along those lines. The classical view of prosecutors is, I will take this case, I will win this case, because that's the only way anybody judges if I'm any good. Now, I tell my students, this is one of the things with that. Young prosecutors, because they're young, they measure success in win ratio. If you talk to old prosecutors that got 10, 15 years in, they know win ratio is not the way you judge a prosecutor, but they have 15 years in, so they have a different perspective. But to be honest, the reason they have 10, 15 years in is because when they were young, they won their cases. So it's a balance of the thing. It's the balance of the thing. Can I do one quick story? Or am I running?
Yes. No, please. I was going to ask you if you had anything else that you wanted to share. I would love it.
The story goes that back in the 80s, you had crack prostitutes. Now, crack prostitutes are at the bottom of the food chain as far as prostitutes are concerned. There is no lower than a crack prostitute, okay? So this is a story the prosecutor told me. This crack prostitute goes to two police officers and tells the police officers she just got raped. Now, already you know the police are not, yeah, really? Because you could look at her and know she was a crack prostitute. She was that bad. Okay, so she says the guy that did it is in this hotel. This hotel is, you book it for 40 minutes. It's that kind of hotel. Okay, so the cops go over, the guy opens up, they look at him. He's barely any better than she is. And she says that he raped her, right? He says, no, I paid her some crack and we had sex and she got angry at me. All right, the cop's saying, I'm not burning 5 hours of report writing time on this. Go take it to the prosecutor. All right, make long story short, this prosecutor gets the case. The prosecutor believes her. Now on paper, the prosecutor can prove the rape occurred on paper. In reality, he expects to lose this case in total. He puts this case in the lost column going into court. But the reason he goes to trial is because he told the defense attorney, you know what? Your boy did this. We're going to trial. He's going to suffer the 2 days of trial. I know I'm going to lose. But your boy's going to sweat the 2 days because he took advantage of this girl. And that shouldn't happen. And I'm going to defend that principle. The Minister of Justice model. Okay, so he goes to trial, goes to the trial. Remember, he walks in expecting to lose. Here we put this in the lost column. So he has her on the witness stand. Now, by this time, we're talking about a year later, she's pulled herself together because of this incident. So she's sitting on the witness stand and she looks like somebody trying to pull it together. So he asks her some questions. He says he didn't plan on asking, so he just asked her because he's going to lose the case anyway. He asked her, what do you think about all this? And she looks at the jury and says, I blame myself. I knew he was no good, but I was crack addicted. I needed the crack and I did it anyway. I knew he was no good and he took advantage of me, but I put myself in that situation and I'm not pretending I didn't. Right? Tears are coming down her eyes and she looks like somebody trying to pull themselves together. Okay, now this is an all-black jury in a black town. So much for the idea that we will not convict, blacks will not convict black males, right? So much for that. But anyway, okay then. Jury comes back 2 hours later, guilty, rape one. Everybody faints in the class, in the courtroom. Judge doesn't believe it. The defendant doesn't believe it. And the prosecutor doesn't. He's like, what? Okay. So they take my man to jail on rape one, his life as he knows it is over. Okay. Jury comes out. He says everybody is crying and the older women that were on the jury, you can tell this was a defense attorney, didn't know what he was doing for a deer because you would not have put them on the jury. That's a whole other story. They come out and they grab the girl and they're crying. And, you know, the older ones instantly have grandma status and they're hugging her and telling her, sweetheart, you've done well. You don't worry about anything. You're lovable. You go out and make something of yourself. Everybody's crying all over the place. All right. He goes back and gets a promotion because he won this case. I tell this story because this is what the minister of justice model is. He didn't take the case because he thought he could win and put it in his win column. He was defending a principle. You took advantage of this poor girl because you knew you could. And you think you're going to walk away because she was at the bottom end of her life and nobody thought anything of her. Well, you know what? I do, and I'm going to lose this case, but you're going to suffer 2 days of trial because you did wrong, and I say so. And I'm going to defend the principle. You cannot take advantage of the weak simply because they're so weak, nobody cares. That's a minister, because he clearly planned on losing. He had no pretense he was going to win this case. He went in to lose, but he went in to defend a principle. And that's the minister of justice concept. Prosecutors, there's a principle they're defending by their existence and what they do. And so I tell this story to my students to engage them to see that the criminal justice system is not a mindless machine you just drop on people. There's a principle that is defending.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you told me that story. I have chills. I'm going to be thinking about that for the rest of the day and probably for the rest of the week. Like, it just, oh, I kind of want to cry a little bit. Is there anything, Arthur, that I didn't ask you about that you would have wanted to say or wanted to share?
No, I think your interview was beyond wonderful. I don't think I have anything.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for making the time for this.